Last week we looked a little bit at Jesus' use of illustrations, comparative language and so forth, different figures of speech. And then we turned our attention to really more of the substance of his teaching, really its effect, but kind of turning that direction because of all the fact that Jesus obviously was the greatest teacher that ever lived, but that's not just because of his methods or his insight into the human psyche, but it's because of the message that he brought. I mean, that's the most important thing. And when you talk about teaching, we can teach a lot of things. I mean, there's teachers of all kinds of things, math and English and so forth in schools, but all kinds of subjects in colleges and universities, or even continuing education of various kinds in your particular field. So there's all kinds of teaching that goes on, but there's no more important subject in the world to be taught than what Jesus taught. It's described in the Bible as what? What terminology is used about the particular doctrine or teaching that he brought? What's the one-word term that we use for it? Truth, but truth was taught in the Old Testament too. What do we call it? Yeah, the gospel. We call it gospel. That term gospel is found 94 times in the American Standard Version of the New Testament. And that English word, which arises from the Greek in various form, occurs 133 times in the Greek Testament. And in the noun form, it's rendered either gospel, evangelion, or evangelist, evangelistes. And in verbal form, you usually see it in terms like preach the gospel. But it's derived from two Greek roots, EU signifying that which is good, beneficial, or excellent, and angelia, which means a message or an announcement. So therefore, gospel means what? What's another way of translating that word? In fact, it might be better to translate it more simply. Good news, glad tidings, beneficial message. That's what he brought. And it's interesting that it was used in a historical basis too. Plutarch, a Greek historian, used that same word, Greek word, to bring news of a victorious battle. Say, good news, glad tidings. The Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, uses that word. You recall in 1 Samuel 31:9 when the Philistines were telling the news, circulating the news that their enemy King Saul was dead. That's the same word that's used. Good news. Saul's dead. Glad tidings. That's that same Greek word that's translated in our English Bibles as gospel. And so there are several expressions that we find that word in different phrases in the New Testament. For instance, in Romans 1:1, it's referred to as the gospel of God. What's the Greek word for God, by the way? Theos, right? And that sometimes can mean or can refer to each of the divine persons, or it can refer to the Godhead collectively. But most likely in this context, the gospel of God, he's referring to the Father. Why would he refer to it as the gospel of God? Why is it the gospel of the Father? This is not complex. Yeah, he's the originator of it. It came from him. And yet in Mark 1:1, it calls it the gospel of Christ. Why would he call it the gospel of Christ? Absolutely. It's all about him. Sacrificial death, right? His resurrection, his ascension, his enthronement, his return. This good news is about him, and it was executed by him. It may have been planned or originated from the Father, but it was carried out by the Son. In Acts 20:24, Paul calls it the gospel of the grace of God. Why would we call it the gospel of the grace of God? What is grace? Yeah, it's favor, and frankly, it's wholly undeserved favor. And so when we call it the gospel of the grace of God, that calls attention to the fact that it's God's desire to rescue us, even though we don't deserve it, right? In Ephesians 1:13, it's called the gospel of your salvation. Again, talking about that redemptive message. And by the way, comes in a message form, right? I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek or Gentile. So it's not something you get by impulse or special illumination, but it comes in a verbal message that has to be yielded to and obeyed. It's also called in Ephesians 6:15, which we'll be studying this summer in our summer series, part of it. Shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Why would it be called the gospel of peace? In what way does it bring peace?
Peace with God.
Yeah, absolutely. It's spiritual peace we're talking about. Peace with God, number one. And it'll also bring peace with our fellow man, that is, anyone else that also accepts it will be at peace with. Be at peace with ourselves, for that matter. If we're at peace with God. Can't be at peace with ourselves if we can't be at peace with God. Christ, when referring to the preaching of John the Baptizer in Luke 16:16, said that John's message was, he described it as the gospel of the kingdom of God. Right? And when Jesus was here, he preached that kingdom was imminent. And of course, John chapter 3, obedience to that gospel, that new birth, allows us entrance into the kingdom. Colossians 1:13, if you're translated into the kingdom of His dear Son, that's where we enjoy all the blessings of the King, right? You have to be in His kingdom. And of course, eventually you want to be in that eternal kingdom. And so it's good news, excellent, prosperous. Well, why is it good news? What's so good about it? Why should it make me glad?
Everything about it is good.
Yeah, everything about it is good. Let's think of this. It's good because of the goodness of the person upon whom it's focused, right? Jesus was the only supremely good person to ever live. In fact, He was so good that He was allowed to take our place and take our punishment for our sins. You remember that rich young ruler said, what? Good master, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said, why do you call me good? Do you know what you just said? Think about what you just said. Why do you call me good? There's only one good. That's God. So if you're calling me good in the sense of ultimate good, then you're acknowledging that I am deity. So I'd say the number one reason it's good news is it focuses upon the ultimately, only supremely and ultimately good person to ever walk this earth. Now that's not to say we can't do good things and we can't be, quote, good people in a comparative sense, in a relative sense, but not good in that sense. Not so good that you've never ever done anything bad. It's good news because it provides atonement for our sin through Him. Justification, sanctification, all those words that are used in the New Testament to emphasize different aspects of our salvation. Redemption, bought back. Sanctification, set apart, right? All those words are used to emphasize different ramifications: cleansing, remission, forgiveness. And I think we talked a little bit about last week. Remember, we talked about its practical effect and how Jesus bridged gaps and broke down barriers and all of that. Well, when you're talking about the gospel and you're talking about its practical moral effect, look at the influence, look at the change that it makes in the personal lives of people and in society in general. We are to be what, according to Romans 12:1? Transformed. We're to be a transformed people. And, I would say finally that it's good news because it's the only news that provides us with hope and the foundation for eternal life, right? For the life hereafter. I mean, people have always wondered. Job wondered whether he might live again. David thought he would. How do I know that? Yeah, he won't come back to me, but I can go to him. But they didn't know much about it, not until the gospel, not until the New Testament, which brought both life and immortality to light through the gospel, right? Jesus taught things and brought things, even perhaps things that had been taught before, he brought them into greater perspective when he came. And we're going to talk about that too. Some of the things that he talked about and emphasized. 2 Timothy 1:10, life and immortality brought to light through the gospel. So it's good news. And that's the difference. That's one of the differences in his teaching. It's not all about his methodology, but it's frankly about what he taught and who he is that makes him the greatest teacher ever. So let's just talk about a few of the things that Jesus emphasized that perhaps were never emphasized like this before he came. And we'll just kind of generally hit some high spots. But one of the things that I think our society, and I'll just start with this one because it's one that people nowadays it's low on the totem pole. And that is the understanding of personal responsibility and accountability. We talk sometimes, we're living in a society, at least in this country, of victimhood. What do I mean by that? If I always think I'm the victim, and I excuse my behavior by that, then I'm really saying what? It's not my fault. And look, it comes in different packages, but this idea, this failure to take full responsibility for our own actions has been going on how long? Right. Since the first humans. What have you done, Adam? Well, it's her fault. What'd you do, Eve? It's his fault. That snake hanging in the tree or wherever he was. Passing the buck. It's not my fault. Somebody else's. We've been doing that for a long time. Long history of refusing to accept culpability for our own personal conduct and actions. Seneca, who was the teacher of Nero Caesar, wrote, "The fates lead us, and whatever awaits anyone in life, the first hour of his birth has been determined." What does that remind you of? The Romans and the Greeks thought about the fates. What do religious people use? Calvinism, right? Well, God's sovereignty is so overriding that His will it's already been decided. So if you think that way, how can it be your fault, right? It's already been decided for me. Free will's a myth. And we've used that in the legal system and so forth, right? It's my parents' fault. Terrible upbringing. I've lived a hard life. I've got all kinds of issues, neuroses and psychoses. My environment's bad. I don't eat good. I mean, we can come up with a lot of excuses why we do the things we do or don't do what we should. But here's the problem. Jesus never, ever endorsed that kind of rationalizing. In fact, I remember on one occasion in John 12:48, he said what? He that rejecteth me, heareth not my words, has one that judges him. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him in the last day. Look at that great judgment scene in Matthew 25. Everybody's going to give an account of their activities here. And the gospel records are clear that each rational person is responsible for his own power of choice and will be held accountable. This idea of not being responsible, it's already been determined. Let's look at a couple of passages. Look over at John chapter 5. Just some simple stuff. Jesus probably gave, I think somebody estimated 200 commands while he was walking around. It wouldn't make much sense to give commands if you couldn't do what? If you couldn't obey them or make the decision to. But notice what he said about these Jews that were after him. I'll go back to, he's talking about the witness born of the Father and the works. Verse 37, and the Father himself who sent me has testified of me. You have neither heard his voice at any time nor seen his form, but you do not have his word abiding in you, because whom he sent, him you do not believe. Well, that's not our fault. Really? You search the Scriptures. Or it might also could be translated, search the Scriptures. For in them you think you have eternal life, and these are they which testify of me. But now notice verse 40. But you are what? Not willing to come to me, that you might have life. You have chosen not to come to me. You will not, one translation says, and that's in a present tense form. You remain unwilling. Think about the prodigal son in Luke 15 when he was in that pig pen. What does the Bible say about him? He came to himself. He came to himself. And then what did he say to himself? What did he say to himself? He's having a conversation with himself. Came to himself, and what did he say? Hey, the lowest of the low have it better than me in my Father's house. So here's what I'm going to do in his conversation with himself. I'm going to get up and go to my Father and apologize and tell him I was wrong, and I'll take whatever he'll throw my way. And then what does the Bible say he did? He just sat in the pig pen. He had this long conversation, and then he just sat there. I watched a movie one time. Actually, I had already read a lot about this incident, but several years ago, I don't remember how many years ago, there was some expeditions on Mount Everest. People try to climb that thing every May. That's the only time of the year the weather clears long enough to climb it. And you get above 28,000 feet, it's called, 28,000 feet, it's called the death zone, meaning that your body starts to die. So you only have so long to get to the top. I think the last stop along the way where you rest is about 26,000 feet or so. And you have to start before the sun comes up, because you basically have to summit by around noon, because if you don't, you're not making it back down. And of course, a lot of people have made it and a lot haven't. And there's frozen bodies strewn along the way because you only have enough power to get yourself down. So nobody can go up there and bring all the dead bodies down. They just get covered up with snow and ice. So Several years ago, there were several expeditions going up, and there was too many people. And storm hit, and several people died, at least eight or nine, that one day. And you may recall the story about Beck Weathers, the orthopedic surgeon from Texas that lost some of his fingers and his nose. He had RK surgery like I have, and the thing about RK surgery is, which was before the laser surgery, once you get into altitude, it causes your eyes to blur up and you can't see. And I guess he didn't realize that. So he got so high that he couldn't see. So he's wandering around in a blizzard on Mount Everest and happens to wander into camp. It was the only reason he survived. And they actually airlifted him out. It was the highest ever a helicopter had ever flown. Some Indian colonel flew a military helicopter to the base camp at like 20,000 feet and picked him up. You understand, the air gets thinner, and so a helicopter can't get lift, but it's the highest anybody had ever flown to get him out. And I say all that just to say that there was one of the guides who desperately wanted his clients. I mean, these people are paying the guides $80,000 to $100,000 a piece to take them up to the top of Everest and back, or to die, I guess. Pay somebody $100,000 to kill you. And he had taken this woman. There were some people that shouldn't have been on the mountain also, by the way, who weren't capable of making this climb. But they paid the money, so they took them. And he desperately wanted to get somebody up to the top who had tried before and couldn't, that hadn't made it. And they just were up there too long. He was trying to get these people to summit, and it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so he's starting to become, disoriented. His brain just shuts down. And so he just sits down. And he had a satellite phone, and they were actually able to get his wife on the phone from Australia to talk to him before he died. And the whole time, the people down in base camp and his wife were trying to get him. They're telling him, get up. Just get up and start walking. And he said, yeah, I'm going to get up. Yeah, I'm going to get up and start, head down the mountain. And, but he couldn't. I mean, he just sat there. He didn't have enough either awareness or physical ability to get up. Because see, nobody can help you up there, recall. I mean, you got to get yourself down. And so, so he just sat up there and died. And that's how some of us are, Yeah, I'm going to get up, right? I'm going to do it today. I'm going to do today what I should have done yesterday. I'm going to obey the gospel today. And people act like it's not my fault. I can't do it. I've got all these excuses to do what's right. And it's a matter of resolve and choosing to do what's right. John 7:17, if any man wills to do his will, he shall know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak from myself. Any man wills, that's expressive of deliberate purpose. Go to the end of Matthew chapter 23. And you are familiar with Matthew 23. Jesus is declaring all those woes on the scribes and Pharisees. And then he has this famous lament at the end of the chapter about the destruction of Jerusalem. And then he goes into the signs in chapter 24 of that coming destruction. And notice verse 37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. The American Standard says you would not. Chose not to. Free will. Revelation 22:17, he that is thirsty, let him what? Come. He that will, let him take of the water of life freely. Matthew 11:28 through 30, come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden. I will give you rest. We can do it. We have the choice. But we are personally responsible and accountable to God for our activities in this life. And we can give a lot of excuses, and people have done it for a long time, and it seems like we do it more now than we ever have. But maybe that's just because there's more people. So personal accountability or responsibility. What else? What about, here's something Jesus brought to this world. Yeah. All right.
If Jesus tells us to come,
Mm-hmm.
aren't we deserving to come? I mean, if we choose that, I mean, do we not deserve to come because of the good news and of His message?
Well, deserving in the sense that,
Because God so loved.
yeah, I don't know, deserving in the sense, it's not deserving in the sense that we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, but I think that point you're making kind of leads us into my next topic, and that is the value of the individual. In other words, Jesus brought something to a world that saw no value in human life, much like, kind of like today, the Roman Empire. The value of every person. Matthew 7:26, look at the birds. What about them, Jesus? They don't sow, they don't reap, they don't store in barns. Are you not much more what? Valuable than they. The value of the individual. Sparrows, he said, don't fall to the ground. Every bird that dies, he knows. Birds. And I'll tell you, I don't care for birds. They're nasty. But even birds, he knows when they die, every one of them. I'm just being honest, I don't like birds. I had to go through a car wash yesterday because of birds. And then he says after that, the very hairs of what? Your head are numbered. Now that'd be easy for Scott, right? But some of you got a lot of hair. And he knows how many hairs you have. So don't be afraid. You're worth more than many sparrows, he said. And then you go over to Matthew 12. That was in 7 and 10. You go over to 12. How much more valuable is a man than a sheep, he asks. Now, we're talking about, he came to a society where you could buy people for 30 pieces of silver. Slaves were thrown to wild animals in the Roman games. Undesired infants were thrown out to die. I'd say his emphasis on the value of the individual was a breath of fresh air. And so to get to your point, in that sense, yes, we are valuable to him. And we have value. And so you look at our society, right? We still have the same kind of lack of respect for human life. Lack of respect for... Why do we have such a thing as road rage? I don't respect you as a person, right? Why do I hurl insults at you? You fool, he says. I call people that. I'll be in danger of the hellfire. And we already mentioned last week his elevation of womanhood. What about his emphasis on truthfulness? Doesn't that show a respect for other people and their value? If I don't respect them, I'm not going to be honest with them. What about his teaching on non-retaliation for personal wrongs? All of that factors into this value. And connected with the recognition of the value of the individual also ties in with respect for human freedom. That's why the only reason we have the type of government that we do is because this nation was founded upon Christian biblical values. If you don't establish one on that, you can't have this kind of government. Communism has no value for the individual. It's all about the collective. And therefore, they don't value the individual, and they don't value human freedom. And in fact, the next time the Olympics is on, watch the Chinese women's Olympic team and see if you can tell them apart. You ever noticed? They cut their hair the same, like men. Why do they do that? Now, I realize sometimes ball teams do things to, create closeness in the group. It's us against them, and we're all going to go out and shave our heads this weekend or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. The Chinese government has made these people look alike. Why? Because they're not free and they don't value them as individuals. It's only what they can bring to the collective, to the Communist Party, and to China. So, value that he brought, the idea of the value of people, is tied to human freedom. I'll tell you something else, another teaching that he brought to the world and brought it into focus more than any other, and that is giving as a lifestyle. Not just looking out for number one, right? In fact, Acts 20:35, Paul quoted Jesus where he said, "It is more blessed to" what? "Give than to receive." He said in Matthew 10, "Whoever finds his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." And we're not talking about the exchange of gifts syndrome like we have in our society, where I give to you what? Expecting what? For you to give me something back. In fact, the older you get, I don't know about your family, but you kind of get to the point where you say, hey, let's stop with the Christmas gifts and the drawing of names and the birthday gifts, because here's what happens. It comes your birthday and I give you what? X amount of dollars. Go out and get yourself something. And then my birthday comes around and what do? Here's your money back. Go get yourself something. That's not the kind of giving we're talking about. Jesus said, hey, in Luke 6, if you love those who love you, what credit is that? Even sinners do that. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? The kind of giving he's talking about, the kind that he displayed for us, is self-sacrificial. It says, I'll give to people who can't give me anything back, right? Whatever, and I'm not just talking about money. I mean, whatever it is, time. Money, maybe. Attention, maybe. Love your enemies. Luke 6 goes on. Do good to them, lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great. You will be sons of the Most High, because guess what? He is kind to who? The ungrateful and the wicked. Remember that? He brings rain on the just and the unjust. No strings attached giving, I guess, as we might say, is what we're talking about. And you can kind of morph that into, and this is highly related, when you're talking about giving, that another aspect of giving, maybe just a sub part of that, is serving. Right? Serving. Doing things for people. Not expecting anything in return. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, right? Give his life a ransom for many, Matthew 20:28. And I'll tell you what, you can add to those concepts giving, serving, forgiving. It's in the same family. Forgiving. That is, somebody does us wrong. We're willing to do what? Forgive. These are all concepts that, frankly, were very foreign to the first century culture. And in some places today, and in many places, are even foreign in our world. We, fortunately, in this country, have generally lived around people that, kind of followed these concepts, because that's, what we were established on. But more and more, you come in contact with people who don't act that way, unfortunately. Another obviously major theme that Jesus brought to the world is faith. Some people say, well, I don't operate on faith. I don't live my life on faith. I base my life on facts. Really? I wonder how many times a day we base our decisions on faith. I'm not talking about Christians. I'm talking about everybody. You go into, some of you, a lot of you, not everybody, but many of you are going to go out to eat for lunch, right? You order your meal. How many of you have a food taster to make sure it's not poison? Anybody? You take your personal food taster with you? How many of you wonder when you get ready to drink your drink that the person in the back didn't spit in it? You ever thought about that? But you do what anyway? You drink it anyway. You drink it and you eat it, no questions asked. Let me tell you something. That's an act of faith. We do a lot of things by faith. We're not there to witness how the food was prepared or the drink was poured or whether anybody slipped anything in it, right? But you're going to eat it and drink it. That's an act of faith. So people do live their lives by faith. A lot of little things every day. How many of you go out and get in your car in the morning and start it up without checking for a bomb? Maybe somebody slipped a bomb under my car. You go out every morning and you remote start your car to make sure it doesn't blow up? No, you just take it by what? You take it by faith that I'm going to start the car and I'm not going to blow up. All right? You think, well, that's silly. No, we do a lot of things by. How many of you believe, how many of you have, how many of you have been to Italy? All right? Absent the people that have been there, do the rest of you believe there is a place called Italy? Now, wait a minute. You say, yeah, but you've never been there. How do you know it's there? You say, well, I've talked to people that have been there. Okay. That's just evidence. I've seen pictures of it. Much more good evidence. I've seen satellite photos from space, and I can see that thing hanging out in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, that's all great evidence. All great evidence which leads you to what? Faith. You have faith, and you have a grounded faith. I think of faith based on very good evidence that there is a country called Italy, even though you haven't been there. So faith is a big part of our lives. And Jesus emphasized it. All people, whether they want to admit it or not, have belief systems of some sort. And Jesus had a lot to say about its role in our lives. And it's interesting to me, I guess more than anything else, that Jesus spoke of faith as the most effective deterrent to fear. Did you know that? The most effective deterrent to fear is faith. Don't be afraid, just believe, Mark 5:36. In the middle of that storm, he asked his disciples what? Why are you so what? Afraid. Have you no faith?
Brother Greg?
Mm-hmm.
Satan has redefined faith in the world to mean a belief without evidence.
Yeah, and you even see that in the dictionaries. One of the definitions of faith in the dictionary is belief in something for which there's no evidence. But that's not the biblical definition. And Jesus made some great claims regarding the practical power of faith, did he not? If you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, You can do this or that. Everything is possible for him who believes, Mark 9:23. Faith was a big part of his teaching. And I would say, well, I got a couple more. One, obviously, life beyond the present. The world in which Jesus lived, they didn't know much about it. But Jesus definitely emphasized that, hey, this is just the start. This is a small part of what's to come. This is your probationary period, and there is life to come. What good will it be if you gain the whole world and forfeit your life? What will you give in exchange for your soul? Don't store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroys, thieves break through and steal, but what? Lay up treasures in heaven. And connected, of course, with the life to come is judgment. Remember what he said in John 14 to his disciples, his apostles? I go to prepare a place for you, right? The last thing I'll mention as far as some of the great concepts that he brought is the power of love. And I know we use that word loosely. I love my parents, I love my wife, I love my dog, I love my pizza, whatever. That's an English word for love. But the idea that Jesus brought about love is a will, an action, a decision, agape, to seek the highest good of other people. That's the kind of love that Jesus brought. Choices are made. We can choose to love or we can choose to hate. It's not a fuzzy feeling like, Walker and Aurora have, okay, or whatever. It's not that fuzzy, funny feeling in the pit of the stomach that young people get. But it's a choice. And of course, the more we study it, the more psychologists talk about how important it is to the human psyche. Think about the gods of those days. Their gods were angry. They didn't like people. And I know that from Exodus 34, and we're going to stop here, but Scott uses this passage a lot in God's description of himself, right? Jehovah, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, so forth and so on. It is one of the principal parts of his nature. 1 John 4:8 says what? God is love. And therefore that's why Jesus brought it, because he's love. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. So if God is love, and that's his primary response to us, then he expects that response from us, right? Deuteronomy chapter 6, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might. That is his primary activity toward us, a choice, a will to put our good first. He loves us. He agapao us, and he asks us to do the same toward him. What does the Lord ask of you? Love him. We are ready for the parables. And that's where we'll start the next time.